All right, we are live. Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe from Bros Grin, and I'm joined by, honestly, one of the most brilliant guys over on Substack, Ian Dunmore, um, which I'll just quickly say, if you've not read his stuff, you have committed a crime against humanity. And against yourself, because this is just, sorry, your Substack's just one of the best.
Oh, thank you.
What I'm particularly fond of is you and Ian, not Ian, Eric Felden, and even I'm noticing Black Sun Archives and Man Behind the Screen do this, uh, meandering and layering in as much meaning into the text as possible. I've tried to do that. I don't know if I've succeeded. So, but you really lean into this, and this is something I really do like, and I cannot stress to the audience. Please check out Ian. Anyways, let's start the interview. So, I'm going to ask you, what is the Ian Dunmore stack? What is it you do there?
Yeah. So Ian Dunmore Stack, Dunmore Dispatch. It's where I create stories. All of them exist in the same world. Thank you for that, Joe. That was a fantastic introduction, by the way. Yeah, a lot of the stories. It's great because I have a novel in the works, but Substack in the format that it is, having these short stories, has allowed me to explore all kinds of little nooks and crannies in the world that it otherwise would have taken me a very long time to get to. And it also allows me to look at it through many different paradigms and stuff. I'm glad that you mentioned, the meaning element, because to me that's very important. For me, the
It is.
theme is a very intense driver of my work. It's often very intentional that I figure out, okay, well, what does this story mean? What is the subtext of it? And I can kind of use that to sculpt stories. Sometimes they advise against that for writers, but for me, I've kind of embraced it. And that's been a little bit of a lodestone for a lot of my work. So, the stories, I post them every 2 weeks. Typically, they're fiction. Sometimes I'll go into nonfiction and complain about a poorly rendered wagon or something, and have a little fun with that, get a little snarky. But for the most part, I try and stick to these short stories in like the 5,000 word range. So Substack says they take about 23 minutes to read, something like that. And just have a lot of fun with it. Really enjoy that. I'm very proud of the little library that I've been able to build up there. I love the community, love the community engagement.
Yeah, it's one of those places where almost every inch of the community is just so darn supportive and whatnot. And
yeah,
what I also think is that short stories are like you said, very useful in exploring every nook and cranny of one's world. And as to the meaning and themes and whatnot, I didn't originally think this, but I've come to realize it. Philosophy and fiction, especially fantasy, are right downstream from each other. And I don't know how anyone can separate the two from each other. I don't know if that's odd, but
yeah, that's a very interesting point, and I like that. The philosophy, at the very least, it manifests in that way. There's an article I kind of have in my back pocket that I've been poking at, and maybe it's a little too philosophical, but maybe I'll release it at some point. But it kind of tries to tackle meaning, because a lot of stories, they call fiction the beautiful lie, and I don't like that. I don't think it's a lie.
I don't like it either.
Yeah, and to me, what it really is it's about it's meaning dense. I've described it as, stories are meaning dense in the same way that a face is meaning dense. Yeah, and it's like a pocket of it. It's like, if you describe it even as like nutrients, well, a story is, like it's vegetables. It's very dense with nutrients. And so you can go there and you can, find these, immense truths within there. And but you start with the meaning and then you arrive at the truth. So it kind of follows this path that is not quite as it's not quite as literal, it's not quite as rational as you would in a philosophical treatise. But what I discovered very quickly, and one of the reasons why I got into fantasy, is because I love philosophy, but I realized that there were things that I could not articulate in philosophy that I needed to write fiction, and I specifically needed to write fantasy in order to properly express.
That's pretty cool. Now, this was not one of my planned questions, but what do you think of Black Knight and other Substackers' tendency to call fantasy the spirit of truth?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I like the idea of the spirit of truth. And fantasy is interesting because, of course, whenever you have fiction, right, you're taking exceptions from reality. And that is kind of the hallmark of fantasy in particular, is the exceptions that it takes from reality. Eric and I wrote in our piece on magic systems about how the exceptions that you take from reality excuse me, exceptions you take from reality are often going to speak the loudest in your story, because those things are exceptional. So in particular in fantasy, where you have an enormous digression from end up in this secondary world, then there's a lot to say in there. There's a lot that is that's being spoken, whether you mean for it to be spoken or not. And so it's, in some ways, it's a more rich environment for that. And I say that, although I will, make a caveat, because there are other forms of fiction that are, how do I put it? That have really profound things to say. One of the things I think about, for example, is Dostoevsky. I love his novels, and but they have such specificity. They occur at this place at this time and with these characters, and the people in it are so very real, and yet the specificity kind of lends itself to a universality in a way. And that's one of the reasons too that in my fantasy I adhere to a realism, and I quibble about little things like a wheel, or like how did people work a loom, or at what times of year did they mill grain, or just minutia like that. It is very important to me, not only because it becomes kind of an adhesive to stick the reader's imagination to the story, but also because there's a richness there that I think sometimes you can miss. And not every fantasy writer writes like that, and totally fine. But I even think of things like Miyazaki's films, which are clearly very high concept. Who's a and you have a walking kind of mech steampunk castle that goes all over the place, or you have servants who are frogs. But if you look at things like the details and how somebody wipes a window, or how somebody mixes up paint or fries an egg, they go spot on. He doesn't skimp on those, and that's something that I try and do as well.
And I have noticed that in your fiction, and some of that is stuff that a lot of people take for granted, but you shouldn't. Like, those minutiae are some of the most fascinating parts of, fiction overall, is just seeing the day-to-day, affairs and whatnot before you set out on the adventure. So I will ask, since you answered actually two questions, why fantasy and how'd you get into this, I'll instead jump to another question. What is your favorite fantasy movie and book, respectively, that you've ever watched / read?
Oh, man. Yeah. Wow. Big question. I never quite know how to answer, because I guess for book, I'm going to give two. one unsurprising and one that might be surprising to some. The unsurprising one is going to be, Tolkien, and, the Lord of the Rings, but also the Hobbit. And yeah, that had a lot of it is that I grew up on it. I think Joe dropped out here, but I'm going to keep rolling. There you are. Okay, we're back again.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I just kept rolling. I hope that's okay.
Okay, so what was your answer?
My first answer was Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit. And although they're very different books, I'm not going to differentiate, because a lot of that showed a depth and profundity of world that I had not experienced before, and frankly, the outsized influence that they had on my childhood is something that I can't ignore. So if I'm answering honestly, I got to answer that one. Okay. The other one that might be surprising, considering some of the things I've said and stuff, is actually Brandon Sanderson's The Way of Kings. And that one, yeah, it's funny. A lot of it was circumstantial. I read that book. It was one of those books that you read that's kind of an inflection point in your relationship to reading and writing and that sort of thing. Because at the time, it was a number of years ago, I was in my first job, and it was one of those, sort of soul-sucking environments that I was in. And, the relationships there were not good, and, there wasn't much going at the time and stuff. And, I was very young. I had just gotten married, and, our boy, he was very sick throughout the whole pregnancy. So there was a lot of that kind of, oppression and that sense of, not being able to escape. And so Kaladin's story in The Way of Kings really resonated with me, that, he's taken into, essentially put into slavery, and, he's put into, this grueling kind of gauntlet of, running with these bridges. And yet he finds a way to rise out of it, and he finds a way to overcome it, and like work with the things that he has, and build a way out. And again, that story just really resonated with me at the time, and in a way it gave me what I needed most. It gave me hope, and hope and honor are kind of thematic in those stories. I didn't love the later books quite as much, but that first one really resonated. And in fact, there were a lot of people who, when they ask me, what's a good book to get into fantasy, that's one of the ones that I recommend, just because it has a really high entertainment value, but it also has sort of that, beating of the human heart kind of feel to it.
Okay, I'll admit I'm not fond of Sanderson, more because some comments he's made, more some minor stuff, but and I'll be honest, some of what I've been told about his style and whatnot doesn't exactly appeal to me. But before people start hitting the mass unsub button, I'll say if it gave us Ian Dunmore, whom I love the fiction of, and gave you hope, then screw it, I'll actually forgive him, and I might even have to get The Way of Kings.
Yes, you recommend it. Sure. Sanderson's interesting, especially, and again, that's why I said that's probably my surprising responses, because Sanderson and I have very different writing styles. He endeavors, and he has a lot of resources out there and stuff, and he endeavors to write as clearly as possible, and he kind of straddles the line between fantasy and science fiction. And
he does.
Yeah, and he has his own, cons and all kinds of other stuff. I understand that,
okay.
There are...
The con thing is cool. Oh, I thought you meant convention. That's cool.
Yeah. He's kind of built his own universe over there. And one of the things that I would say about him and his writing style is that from the things I've heard him say, and, I listened to a Google talk with him and stuff, I think what he is his bias is toward, opening up the gate as widely as possible. So, while, there might be folks who disagree with him, politically or culturally or those types of elements, his goal is to kind of make himself, more widely accessible. And I think that also kind of explains his writing style, which is very plain. Yeah. Some people, do not like it. which to each their own. And honestly, I like the more ornate styles and stuff, but I have to give it to him that the Way of Kings resonated with me.
All right, I'll have to check it out because I keep hearing adverse things about him. And you recommended this book, and like I said, I like your stuff, so I'll have to look at it and see for myself because you can't really know a person or a style until you check it out yourself. And um, put plainly, I think he's done a lot of good for the genre. I also think um, he's done some what I consider marvelizing, like Marvel MCU stuff, which I'm not fond of what that's done for cinema because I like Shawshank, I like The Majestic, I like those the Hammer movies. I like movies that have all these layers and themes and whatnot. But like I said, if you know uh, if you recommend it, I'll definitely check it out. Right after I finish Comte de Monte Cristo, which
Oh yeah. That's
I have a passionate love affair with Alex Dumas. Like, well, anyone who's read my stack knows I have a passionate love affair with him because I love his stories.
man. I
Um,
need to pick those up. I need to pick those up. I have not read
oh,
those. It's interesting
en France,
because sorry, go ahead.
Comte de Monte Cristo is free for right now on Kindle in French. So if you know
Okay.
French, you can read it for free. I about just swooned with joy when I saw that, and my brother just immediately leaped, and my mother herself, who's never read Dumas, no, I think she's read him like 25 or 30 years ago, was like, "Oh wow, okay, I'm gonna have to pick that up. Send me that link, damn it." And
I wish I spoke French. I
d'accord.
suffer from the American malady of being, decidedly unilingual, and try
Well,
to learn other
there's
ones, but there's just not enough speakers of
it's
other
never too late.
languages. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
And like there's a lot of resources. And if you're anywhere near Quebec, or even Maine has a lot of French people. So, it's always possible. There's a lot of resources. And I'm going to be probably posting up a book list of some of the, because I'm having to go back for my French degree. I'm going to be putting up a lot of the basic French courses materials if you want. So I can, so that'll be available to people and people could pick up the books in some format and start trying to teach themselves because that's how these books are organized. You're supposed to kind of start teaching yourself French with
Hmm.
them.
Yeah, that's
It's a
fantastic. I
breeze.
like that.
It's a breeze for me because my first language was French. I didn't speak English till 7 years old, but
Wow.
you know, this is something which could help a lot of people discover the greatest language in human history. Okay, but
I'm sure most
uh,
native French speakers would agree with you on that.
ben
From what
oui, uh, but okay. So how about fantasy movies? What's
fantasy
your favorite?
movies, a cop out answer, but the Lord of the Rings movies, and I know that there's, a lot
How's
of,
that a cop out?
because I just said Lord of the Ring book.
No,
So yeah,
like
the movies,
it's
of
okay.
course, again, were a touchstone of my childhood. I
Yeah,
remember, you know, the prior generations in particular all have stories about watching movies when they were too young to, and I wasn't too young to watch the Lord of the Rings, but I do remember seeing the Fellowship of the Ring and sitting next to my dad in the theater and the entire Mines of Moria. I'm surprised that my dad didn't have to have his arm amputated. I was squeezing it so hard during the whole thing, but like just transfixed to the giant screen and you know
that's what.
experiencing that. That was
Yeah,
just
I experienced that with Star Wars Episode One with the Duel of Fates.
yeah.
Sitting in that theater with my dad and just squeezing his arm and just because before that I didn't know Star Wars like he did. He was like, "Oh, you should have been there in '77," and I was like, "Yeah,
Hmm.
whatever." I don't get the attraction of these movies you keep having me watch on VHS. Going to the theaters and that's like, it's impossible to describe. So on some level, I do understand. Those movies were just but yeah, there's something to be said about that first great experience. And it's not a cop out answer. Now, who is your favorite fantasy character? It could be cinema, video games, books, whatever.
That's a great question. Wow. Oh man, I might need to think about that one.
Gotcha.
Yeah, yeah. Hmm. This is a funny one, but in Tad Williams' Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn series,
I love
the
that.
minstrel,
Dragonbone
the,
chair.
the, yeah, the minstrel Sangfugal. I don't even know
Oh
if
yeah,
I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
yeah, I know
But
him.
yeah, I remember, I read that one earlier on when I was getting into fantasy, and Tad Williams is very ornate, very.
Mm,
I don't I don't know how to describe it. At the time, it felt like a little
magic.
bit. Yeah, at the time when I began, it felt a little bit, cumbersome and top heavy. But as I started to read it and you sort of appreciate it, it's a little like when your dad takes you for a walk through the woods and you're just bored and you want to go back home and play with toys and stuff. But then you go out there for long enough, or, I have these recollections with my dad going hunting, and, you don't really get it until you've spent X number of hours out there, just sitting out there with
Yeah.
nature and just watching the forest kind of come alive around you. And I
Mm,
felt that in those books. It took me a couple of hundred pages to get to the point where I realized what was going on. And before that, I would kind of denigrate those kind of like,
yeah.
Eric probably remembers this. I would complain about the fantasy books that were just long walks in the woods, is what I called them. But there's something to walking in the woods. There's something to that, and seeing nature around you and seeing things come alive. And I kind of felt that with Tad Williams, and the one that it came out with was that character of Songfugal, because I didn't I didn't get the sense of him until we were a long way into the narrative, and then I could
Mhm.
kind of see that he was coming out in subtle ways, in subtle but
Yeah.
profound ways. His character was kind of emerging. You sort of started to see, his merriment and stuff, but it was the kind of merriment that wasn't in your face. It was,
Yeah.
there's it. What I like to compare it to is like in if it were a movie put on, by Hollywood, and they only had, whatever, 90 minutes to, make, the first book into a movie, then the way they would have introduced Songfugal is that, Simon would have walked into a tavern and saw him dancing on a table and, kicking, mead flagons across the room and everything as he's strumming and singing out loud and everything like that. Tad doesn't do that. He gives him more of a human entrance, and that was really interesting for me. There was a lesson in that for how one can
Mm,
write and how one can build characters and really build real people on the way.
yeah. What I like about Tad Williams in Dragonbone Chair is that a lot of the intros are muted, and
Hmm.
um, and the thing is, it's kind of what I tried to do with Gemstone. Just try to introduce in a muted fashion each character, not in a grandiose way, and try to weave that spell slowly and whatnot. It's a very fascinating storytelling technique. And I will confess, I really like Joshua and Prester John and Simon in there. And they all inspired one of the characters I wrote into Crown of Blood. Simon, yeah, named after Simon.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I know that. I read that the way Tad Williams makes his stories are that hey Arigmar, I see you there in the chat. Doing well, doing well. The way in which I heard that he crafts his stories, or
Mhm.
every author kind of has their favorite sort of profile that they approach stories in, because at the end of the day,
Yeah.
the story becomes the story, and all of these things sort of blend together. But you have things like plot and character and setting and tone and and prose, and frequently an author will have a favorite of those, and once you realize what that favorite is, then it kind of informs their style, and it really shows in their work. Tad Williams, his two favorites are world building and characters, and to me that really comes out. You can feel that in his
The two best
work.
ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So those are the things that really emerge and really shine.
Okay, so what would be your favorite fantasy character you've written?
Yeah, I'm gonna pick one. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Can I pick three?
Oh, go ahead. As many as you want.
Okay. Cool.
One
of them is a character who is in the novel now I'm working on, so I won't say much about him because I'd like that to remain on the page. And before anyone asks, I don't know when that will necessarily be complete. I have a full draft of it complete, but I got to go back and do a lot of editing. And frankly, I've been distracted by all the fun I've been having on writing short stories on Substack.
That happens.
Yeah, so frequently. Yeah, that character. His name is Valentin, and he begins the story with a very kind of dog eat dog mentality about the world, and because he's had some of the most cherished things taken from him when he was young, and so he wants to pass on an inheritance to his son as well. And so a lot of the dynamic is the relationship between him and his son, who is the other main character. And so it's very much a father-son story, is this book. And it has a lot of my relationship with my dad and my relationship with my son in it. And,
That's
kind of the
beautiful.
tensions and the aspirations and the hopes and the dreams and the rebellion that goes along in that. It's always very important to me that I don't descend into, kind of a two-dimensional view of these things. And I don't have it like, oh, the dad just needs to change, or, oh, the son just needs to grow up. To me, it's very much, that's not how the real world works. It's much more complicated. As far as characters for that I've written on Substack, there's two of them. One is Brocken, who is the main character in The Puck's Favor. And The Puck's Favor is a story about, Brocken, who is, part of this marginalized community living in a rural area. And he too has had much taken from him. He was orphaned at a young age, a lot of that due to abuse from the county that he lives in. And essentially the story is about him making a deal with the devil to kind of rise and rise to a higher level of security and get the things that he always believes that he's wanted. And I love that character because there's a lot of complexity, and a lot of the complexity that I added was I tried to add subtly, not having him stated explicitly. And so I love that story, and I love him. Another character, the third one that I'll pick, is from the story when the gods came rollicking to our isle. I don't remember. I think that title was too long when I made it. But that one, I kind of tried to aim for humor in that one and make it more of a fun story. And I won't give away too much, but essentially I wanted to write a story that was just like a pub brawl, essentially, like a brawl that breaks out of a pub.
Oh, that sounds awesome.
Utterly out of hand. And that's sort of what happens, but a lot of the story is like the build up to that point. And so what it is, it's about these three gods from an older pantheon who arrive on this island, this sleepy little isle, sort of like Emerald Isle sort of look. And they're the one she's kind of modeled after she has a Valkyrie vibe to her, and she's just there bent on having a good time. But
okay, I'm gonna need that link after.
Yeah, no, it's a fun one. But then that one there's more of a depth that comes from it, and I enjoyed making kind of like the the archetype of like the female warrior, but also, kind of getting in and giving her a sense of, okay, well, what's going on underneath, and kind of that out, and creating someone real through that.
That's awesome. I don't doubt she's awesome. Like I said, please do provide me that link after this. I'm gonna need to read that
for sure. Yeah, let me write that down.
I'm a sucker for Valkyries, because my favorite video game is Valkyrie Profile.
Valkyrie Profile. I don't know if I've heard of that.
Yeah. Oh, it's basically about you play as the first game is about you playing a Valkyrie who has to choose the Unheriar, and it's an anthology game of sorts. You're going from hero to hero, witnessing their tragic ends. As some of them will start off in their stories as villains, and then when they go to meet their end and they realize they're going to die, they have a change of heart. And because the game really goes, she's not just choosing the strongest people; she's choosing the people of the strongest core, the people who are true heroes. It's a very beautiful game, but very tragic, and it's inspired apparently by the story of Brynhildr and Sigurthur. So it's got layers and layers, and I love this game. But I've not played it in like 2 years because life's being kind of mean to me and not letting me.
Life has a way of doing that.
Yeah, adulthood sucks sometimes, but sometimes. But it's got its moments. It's got its moments. But you know what? I'm gonna actually give you the entire floor and stop interrupting. So we're gonna solo lay out you and ask you, tell me in as much detail all about your world, please, for the audience.
All right. Wow, so much about the world. So I am going to ask something, Joe. Feel free to hop in with questions, because the questions help me like frame where I'm going with stuff, and I enjoy answering questions. It's easier actually for me to work with constraints than with a blank slate, which may or may not show in my writing, in fact. All right, so my world. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, how many kingdoms, and what's the oldest one?
Wow. Oof, geez. So my world is based on kind of an early modern setting. So a lot of the kingdoms are ones that have risen and fallen, and there are other ones that have sort of, claimed some inheritance, but that inheritance might be more for marketing than it is literal. And so as far as kingdoms, partly my answer is I don't actually know, because I don't know where the margins are of my entire world. There are some areas that I know much better than others. If you are to look at a map, which I've never made a map in detail, I struggle to make maps. Honestly, Eric always gets mad at me because he's always asking me for a map. He's been literally bugging me about it for like 10 years. And I give him something that I've drawn on a napkin. You have, over on one side, you have this isle, which is known as Thydos. And humans are a little bit newer at this area. And then you have the old world, which is Mycresia. Mycresia has, kind of the seat of the Creed, which is the, prevailing religious power, but that religious power is at this point in history beginning to balkanize, and you're having all sorts of smaller sects that are emerging out of that, and with their own interpretations, and there's the politics behind that and stuff. Religion plays a very important part in my world. It's something that the more that I've studied it, the more I've realized that it needs to be taken seriously. That's not something that's fully arbitrary. It's very important to me, and it becomes one of those principles that the more that I lean into it, and the more that I consider it and say, okay, well, what did these people actually believe? Where did that belief come from? Then it becomes less and less arbitrary, and more something that is sculpting the world. So that's something that I find really fascinating. So you have the old world and then you have the new world. If I were to back up and kind of talk about Thydos, which is kind of this this newer region. And when I say newer, I mean that it's been around for a very long time. I don't mean like it's like the America's New World. This area is sometimes it's referred to as the Feywild, and the reason why is because that it's considered to be sort of the last frontier of where elves and fairies dwelt and that kind of thing, and they're sort of receding west. There's a little bit of Tolkien in there, I guess, and so this area has its own flavor and character. I would compare it to like Western Europe in particular, and so you have these pockets in that area that are still kind of untamed, where the magic still teems in a way that it doesn't necessarily in the old world. In the old world, you are going to get more things. I would kind of compare the old world to, Constantinople, Asia Minor, Egypt, and even the Indian subcontinent is in there a bit. But I spend most of my time in this area that I call Thydos, which is more has sort of the Western European overtones. It's interesting. Another big thing that I used as a touch point for creating the world was languages. So I'm sure you'll appreciate this. A lot of fantasy authors, they treat the language in their world as that the book that they're writing is simply a translation. Like that was Tolkien's take, was that the Lord of the Rings is a translated text of this one that was written in something in a completely different language. And in fact, he had real names for all the characters, like Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin and all of them. And he even treated those ones as translations into modern English from that. I wanted to be able to render this area in modern English. And when I say modern English, I mean like Shakespearean English, for the most part, Shakespearean English. I dropped the and thou because that was a little bit of a bridge too far. I don't use that a ton. So that conjugation for the pronouns, I didn't retain. But the rest of it, I tried to go in and I tried to say, okay, well, if I wanted to render modern English, then how do I do that? Well, if you're going to render modern English, then you need a Middle English. In order to have a Middle English, you need to have something akin to a Norman conquest. In order to have a Norman conquest, then you have a prior existing Old English, Germanic language in there with a little bit of like Brighton Celtic, and then you need kind of a violent influx of Norman French. And so as soon as I started doing this, then it started bringing up all these ideas of, okay, well, how would I do that? How would I have this going on? And that became a really powerful tool for building out the lore of the world. And I got a lot of information out of it and a lot of sense of like where the culture is, where these other land masses are, etc. And in fact, it's one of the things that I answer very quickly when I'm developing a new area in my world is, what do these people speak? And if they speak this, then what influences do they need? If I have an area that is something more similar to Spanish, then all right, I have that, but then Spanish has a little bit of an injection of Arabic in there, from the Moorish occupation. So do I have a Moorish occupation? And if so, then where's the Arabic coming from? And Arabic is a language that's highly tethered to, the Quran and the Muslim religion. Okay, now we have religion in there. So, where does the religion emerge? And that religion emerged at this point in history, in these centuries. And I'm over here in those centuries. So, how do I splice things together? So this is kind of my very haphazard method of world building, is I do this kind of thing. And so religion and language are big for me. I know that didn't fully answer your question, but let me circle back to that. Where do you think would be useful for me to go in describing my world?
Well, language and history are things of exceedingly great importance to me with my stories as well. So that's a detail I was going to ask about. All right. So you said you're looking back to history and you've got all these different parts of your world and whatnot, and you've mentioned gods before. Um, what's is there a pantheon of gods or is there a single god in there? Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like from which they originate from.
Uh-huh. Yeah, very,
Tell me
very
about
good
the
question.
cosmology.
Yeah, the cosmology. So the people in my world would disagree on some of the cosmological minutia. But from my perspective, there is one creator who's kind of standing over and against this, and kind of taking a page from the Silmarillion. The way that I've thought about the cosmology is that, yeah, you have this one creator who stands over and against it, and he's made this creation, and then there are sort of sub creators, I guess akin to like the Valar or angels or whatever you might want to call them. I sometimes refer to them as ancients, and that some of them, many of them are good. Other ones had more malicious intent or selfish intent, and that they became involved in the world, and in so doing, they sort of got trapped in the physicality and the temporality of the world, much like how an insect gets caught in resin, I guess, is often how I compare it. And so you do have these great beings, but the fact that they get sort of entangled in this, in this causality chain, in this, matter space time continuum, means that that's going to change them as well. And so I do have gods who have changed over time, over the millennia, and they've sort of become something else. And some of them rise up with rapacity, and they attempt to become like rulers and such. In fact, that was a question I had to answer very early on. Is like, well, if I have these uh, divine creatures of immense power, why haven't they just shown up and taken over the world? And that question actually became one of the short stories I have on here, called The Spurned King. The Spurned King, an epistolary, which is a story about, well, it's an epistolary. So it's a woman, I think she's a duchess, and she's in prison, and she's sneaking out, she's expecting to be executed, and she's sneaking out one final letter to her sons, kind of exhorting them to maintain virtue, basically, even in spite of the fact that she's likely done for, and saying like, don't succumb to the malice of these people who have betrayed us. And she recalls the story of this ancient named the Spurn King, who essentially woke up one day and looked at the greatest city in the world, Grova Marna, and said, "Why aren't I king? I could become king in an afternoon." And he essentially does that. And how does it play out after that? Why is he not still sitting on that throne and being waited on by mewling subjects? And that's that is that short story was kind of answering that question. Um, but yeah, so there are these gods, and the question of how they behave, they have more of a sense of like the polytheistic pantheons that you would see among the Greeks or the Norse. And again, going back to that question of religion, there is a dynamic between them and this movement of Abrahamic religions that has emerged, that posit a one God, posit a first mover, and so that interaction creates its own character moments. You also see that in that one that I mentioned, with the sort of Valkyrie proximal character, that one when gods came rollicking to our isle. That is also, that kind of influence is also there in that story as well, because the three gods who go down there, they're very much, they're gods, and they have immense power and stuff, but in a regard they're yesterday's gods, and so there's a dynamic going on there as well. Yeah. So where do I go from here? The history obviously is, a really deep well. As I'm sure anybody who's read my stuff or read Eric's stuff, history is very important. I care very much about the human elements in my story, and in my stories, very much about going in and looking at the basic human experiences. When I think about, one of the questions that you had said that we might discuss here is, what are some of the challenges facing fantasy today? And one of the things that I have sensed now and again is, there's great value, and I don't want to, speak negatively about, heroes' journeys, because there's great value in those, and in a regard that's, an archetypal shape of a story that, ends up in a lot of places, and in a way you can sort of graft it onto all sorts of different stories, even if it's just one about you going to the store. But in a way, in fantasy, you can look back at history, and you see the way that people lived, the majority of people lived, and then you look back at heroes' journeys, and sometimes you can have a sense that those were the stories that mattered. And again, I don't want to speak too negatively about heroes' journeys and stuff, because I've written those as well, and they're a ton of fun. There's a lot of value to them, but there's also something to be said for the fact that in the ancient world, 98% of people were farmers. And oftentimes just being a farmer is where the story begins, and then the hero goes off and does something else. And the adventures and stuff, they're fantastic. And I want to be very clear, so I'm at the risk of repeating myself, it's a really powerful thing, and it's very valuable. But if 98% of people were farmers, then the majority of our ancestors were farmers. So you and I are made of farmers, and we're made of these people who were simple folk, and who lived these lives that were very close to the earth. And they had these, what does that do for their values? What does it do for their way of life? What did the scope of their lives look like? What did their aspirations look like? And that's something that very much interests me. And I think about things like how a lot of times you'll see your main character hero goes riding through a village, and the village is utterly wrecked. There's window shutters are yawning open in the breeze, and you have empty doorways, and you have the waif standing there, in a tattered outfit, and arms like twigs and hungry eyes, and the hero throws him a loaf of bread and keeps walking. And it gives this sense of sometimes your main characters have immunity to things like that, like starvation or destitution. But the fact of the matter is that even today, there are people who suffer from that. And up until very, very, very recently, that was a clear and present danger for a lot of humanity. And that shows up in my writing as well, and that shows up in my world building, is that for me, those elements like starvation and destitution and pillaging and plagues and stuff, those are not just plot devices. Those are not just set pieces. Those are things that actually happened and actually happen and will happen. It's one of the things that I tapped into in the story A Luton in the City. The Luton is he's an immortal, and he's sort of wandering through the events of history, and just looking for his next beer at the beginning of the story. And he ends up falling in love with this girl, but then she doesn't accept him, and so he ends up returning multiple times to see the the world that she's in now, and you do end up being confronted with those things like starvation. And to me, again, that's very important. It's very important that that's not just a plot device. This is something that actually occurred, and we should be confronting it, and or at the very least, that's something that I want to confront in my stories.
I get that. Ironically, I've not yet. I think I've only confronted that kind of in one English story and no, wait, one short story and one novel, and I've ended up. It's a major theme in my French novel, which is basically from the point of view of a farmer who's trying to care for and protect his sisters, and he ends up basically joining the local monastery in order to, even though he wants to marry, because he wants to provide for them, and the best way is as a monk. But that's where, okay. Now we're, I think, approaching the end of the show. I'll just go like this. I actually really loved how much detail you told us about. So I will now ask, if the dog won't stop barking. It's because the chipmunk in the local tree, she just goes berserk over. It's a good thing the big dog hasn't gone berserk yet.
No, she's just guarding her castle. That's what she's doing.
Wait till the big one does it. He's even worse sometimes. But who is your favorite? Who are your favorite substackers of fantasy fiction or anything at all? And I know it's going to be Eric Falden.
yeah. Unfortunately, yeah, it's going to be Eric Falden. And I know, yes,
Eric's kind
I've
of
been
mandatory.
Yeah, and I've been friends
He's
with him
awesome.
for a very long time, but he was one of the ones who persuaded me of the value of leaning into realism in a way, and that realism is not an end within itself. It's something that increases, that raises the caliber of the story, and that's one of the things that he kind of taught me. In fact, just as a little anecdote, when I first, when we first met and we started sharing our work, he was working on his own fantasy series and I was working on a science fiction one. And I was a fantasy author and I didn't realize it yet. And the science fiction story that I was writing very much had fantasy overtones in it. And at some point I switched and, I went over, I said, okay, I'm going to shelf this. And I think it's been, shelved indefinitely, which might be for the best. Some stories, they need to, they need to compost. And I switched over to a fantasy tale and I started working on it. And, he would ask questions about it that, at the time I couldn't answer and I couldn't necessarily understand the value of. I would tell him about, okay, I've built this kingdom and, this is what happens and these are the rulers and this is, I don't know what their army looks like and these are the weapons they use. And he would ask me something, this shouldn't be surprising to anyone, but he would ask me something very pointed about why do they use those weapons? That's not a good weapon to use for that context. And I'd be like, yeah, but it looks cooler. He'd be like, okay, but what happens if X happens? And I'm like, hey, shut up. But after going back and forth like that a while, and him asking questions about even, kingdoms was another thing. And I think kingdoms was kind of the turning point for me when he had poked me enough about, this made up kingdom that I had created that I realized that I hadn't created a kingdom. I had just replicated the United States and, slapped a guy in a crown at the top of it. And that kind of made me go back. And I remember the conversation when I said to him, I realized that the story in the world I'm making is very, very, very American. And I think that's the reason why it keeps not feeling right. And so I asked him kind of, what the hell is a king? And he backed up and because he's so fantastic at this, he gave me this lecture about, what the hell is a king? you know? And what does a king do? And where does his value derive from? And why did they have kings? And why do they have kings rather than, this elected leader? Or why did they have a divine right? Or why did it have to be ratified by the church? And that really started to set the gears in motion. I think that I started to appreciate, this as such a great storytelling tool. And that's something that Eric always does very consistently. And so, it shouldn't surprise anyone, but I have to go with Eric Falden. So if anybody has not looked at his stuff, they ought to do that.
All right. Yeah. Well, I enjoy seeing Eric's little notes in notes and whatnot, as well as some of his posts. Because, well, I don't know if you know this. I'm a former history research assistant and student, so like it's like someone asks, "What's a king?" I launch into this long diatribe, like, okay, let's go back to the later Bronze Age. You see, back then, what a king was, and then it's like, yeah, and that's annoyed my mother, who goes like, all right, so how this guy, why do you have a king of this realm? Well, okay, in ancient Egypt and with the ancient Hittites, what happened with no, I'm asking about your story, not history. Well, I'm getting to
Yeah.
that. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm totally understanding Eric, but Eric is able to put it more succinctly, I can't say it in English, succinctly than I could, and that's something I greatly admire. He's a great mentor on that
And
front,
one of,
and
one of the things I'm going to add to, just sorry to hop in there, but about Eric that I appreciate is that he's able to provide not just the what, but the why. And
yeah,
so, he can talk about not just, he can talk about Henry and Henry II, and he can talk about what happened there and the dynamics and stuff, but he can also explain the why in a way that is comprehensible so that we can kind of break out of the mindset. And the reason for breaking out of the mindset is not because, we all should be role playing as medieval peasants or something like that, but because, as he notes often, it immunizes us from the fallacy of just believing that people in the past are different than the way that we are because they were dumber or because they just
yeah,
hadn't figured stuff out yet. And
and
that's,
the the reality
go ahead.
is they were much more like we are today, and like I'm glad you mentioned Henry the First and Henry the Second. The Anarchy Wars, for example, is one of the most fascinating periods in English history, as we have basically the inheritors of the kingdom that die on the white ship, and
Mhm.
this is akin to like the entire departments of the U.S. going up in flames,
Yeah, yeah.
and on a yacht. It's like, who's going to run this in the next
Yeah.
generation? Well, there is no one, and everything erupts into flames. But to an extent, you kind of have to say it has to, for them to determine what comes next, because you have and the Empress, who's an option, but the problem is she's kind of cold and cruel and has a bad temper. But you have Etienne, who's weak and nice, but nice guys have to finish last. So you have this. Your choice is a nice guy who invites chaos, or an overbearing um, uh, tyrant in a way. But at the same time, she has legitimacy on her side. But everybody likes Etienne. I mean, Stephen. That's what the English call him. So the dynamics are very important, and kingship was also a grassroots thing because you wanted your chieftain, and it points upwards towards heaven. So there's also a religious aspect, and it combines all these elements of because the king is bound to his people and bound to the land, but he's also bound to
Yes.
heaven. So he's an intermediary. He's a middle point between heaven and earth. But the thing is, some kings understood this better than others. And Henry II, or Henry II, comes in when the realm is exhausted and people are finally tired of war and are willing to say, all right, even Etienne is saying, listen, I have my own sons, but I'm so tired of this war, I'll surrender the crown to you. Just, wait until I'm the picture. Uh, and Henry acquiesces. So the transition is also important because people just fight and fight and fight and slaughter until they're exhausted. But in comes this dynamic king who's honestly the greatest king in English history, who has this ambition, this drive that's similar to Charlemagne's. Sorry, I can get lost in this. This was something that fascinated me in university. I shouldn't continue going because this will become a university history lecture and podcast. It's
No,
not about that.
you have given me some stuff to research here. That's a segment of history I haven't focused on as much. I've
Well,
again, early modern is more the kind of thing. In fact, when I read Ian Mortimer's Time Traveler's Guide to Elizabethan England, that was
good
a big one. And as soon as I read that one, I was like, I'm sorry, I need an Elizabethan London, and now I've got one. And it's because that city and that time period and like the kind of pressure cooker that it was just so cool to me. And it's at exactly the point that I wanted in terms of like the evolution of the English language. So that's that's more my stomping ground. But I got to research that. I got to look into some of the stuff you're talking about. It's fascinating.
well, I'll recommend a few books. Dan Jones, who is on Substack, but he doesn't really interact with anyone. Not that he needs to. He's awesome. He's too high tier for the rest of us. He has his Plantagenet book, which is all about the entire history of the Plantagenet up until the War of the Roses, House of Lancaster, really. That's when he cuts off, and his second book picks up. So Plantagenet, you have W.L. Warren's Henry II, which is the leading top tier book on Henry. And even though historians say do not pick up an older book, here's a newer one. This one is so good, so thorough that even though it's from the 60s, I think 63, professors still rely on it. And it is pre-revisionist history, so it's a lot better. Revisionism did some good, but it also screwed some stuff up and messed with our notions of history.
It's very interesting that you bring that up too, because in the 60s, I think that was when what's his name? I shouldn't have brought this up if I couldn't remember the name. The Face of Battle. Who wrote that one? The Face of Battle?
I don't remember.
I believe it started with a K, but that was one of the ones that again emerged in the 60s, and some of it was reactionary to a lot of the things that were happening in academia. Because it's my understanding that at that time, in terms of military history, there was a great emphasis on kind of analyzing the culture of armies and the repercussions of that. Yep. But he went in and he kind of looked at the archaeology of it, and so he picked battles where the corpses and their armor and stuff were very well preserved. And
exactly. And
and he looked at that, and so he was one of the ones, for example, that was looking at these muskets that were, left on the battle that, that had multiple rounds rammed into them, like 3 of them. And he was asking like, well, what happened there? What happened there is that the dude either forgot that he hadn't shot his gun yet, or he didn't want to, and he was just pretending to reload, and he had no intention of shooting. And so that kind of started to have implications about the psychology of killing, and that led to more stuff. Eric can talk so much about this, but anyways, it made me think of that you're talking about. Kind of these seminal works emerging in the 60s.
Yeah. Now Warren relies on archaeology, but also he apparently basically lived in the archives over in London. I say he basically lives there because he references, yes, there's documents dating back to almost like King John's reign, and he's going, it's this document and this. You have modern historians just looking at that and going, how do you know the exact section almost? And you have Warren who knew every nook and cranny of almost every archive in the south of England, it seems. I deeply, deeply admire him and revere him. If I had a time machine, I wouldn't go back and shoot anyone. I would probably go back and just say, jot down notes from him and Tolkien and just say, all right, so what year was it? Okay. And just basically just geek out at his feet. But There's Dan Jones. There's W.L. Warren. I've got a few of these books on my. Well, no, they're in boxes now. What with all the moving around for work. Let me see. Well, that's a good starting point. I'll try looking some up, and maybe I'll just do a bibliography thing and say these are the books I recommend for a post. Maybe I'll just do that in a few days. Henry II is quite good. Oh, it's not. It's kind of Henry II adjacent. W.L. Warren's King John. It is the most thorough book on King John's reign, but also a bit of King Richard's and Henry's, and even Philip Auguste a little. He delves into each of the kings, their bureaucracy, the battles, the composition of their household staff, army, whatnot. So if you get, the thing is about the King John book is you all psychology of the kings, of Henry, Richard, and John. But the thing is, what's also being done is that he is presenting to you the how do I put it? A good portrait of what King looked like, and it's impossible not to really appreciate the research that went into it. Oh, and Jim Bradbury's Capetien, which I'm actually doing a book club podcast of sorts. Here, let me see if I can turn my camera on. Here it is. It's not perfect, and I highlight all the problems with it, but also the strengths here, because this is a book which, shoot, my darn camera, my darn internet. But the book is a profound seminal work along with The House of Lilies, which I'm currently reading through and really enjoying. And the thing is, this is a book that covers from Charlemagne all the way to the beginning of the wars, the 100 Years' War. And it is a seminal work. And the finest book on the Capetien, along with House of Lilies, that I've been able to find in English. And so this one really presents the Capetien kingship, which is markedly different in character and style in a lot of ways than the kingship of Britain. Britain tried to, pursue the shadow of sorts of Capet. But this house was one that seems more august and whatnot. But they can trace themselves back genetically to Charlemagne. So, they're a little more confident. I don't want to say arrogant, but they're like, they have that prestige about them.
Yeah, they have the pedigree.
Yeah, whereas this is a bit of a sore point for the Plantagenet, who have a lot to brag about. They have Henry II in their family tree, but there's a bit of an inferiority complex there. They have the Empress within their lineage, and that's amazing. They have someone who had the title of Empress, but you see, it's not quite the same as Charlemagne, who is Emperor. So, yeah, sorry.
No, it's all right. No, I could keep going. I could keep going, but I should probably cut this off. Get some work done at my day job. But no, this is fantastic. I love this stuff.
Same. But anyways, I'm going to encourage everyone to check out Ian Dunmore's Substack, which honestly, the stories are just, there's amazing because of the detail, the minutiae, the world building, which, you might have guessed by my love for history, is an obsession. So world building is something I definitely appreciate. So if anyone listening likes world building, you're going to like Ian Dunmore's Substack. And you're not going to stop. It's going to be a terrible drug for you.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Joe. And thank you so much for putting this on. Thank you for everything that you do for the community. And, I said I'm going to give you a shout out too. Everyone needs to check out Brothers Crane as well.
Thank you. You're too kind. Take care, everyone. And until next time.